Let's talk about something that no news cycle, no foreign policy drama, and no carefully orchestrated media distraction has been able to kill. Because right now, while the White House is busy waving the flag of an Iran crisis and trying to redirect your attention toward the Middle East, there is a woman sitting somewhere, probably very quietly, very carefully, hoping that you forgot about her. That woman is Melania Trump. And if you thought her legal nightmare was going away, you haven't been paying attention. Let's start from the very beginning, because the full story here is something that most people don't understand. And once you do, you'll realize just how badly this is all backfired on the First Lady of the United States. Michael Wolff is a journalist and author. He's the man who wrote Fire and Fury, the explosive book about the chaos inside Trump's first term. He's written 4 books about the Trump world, and over the years he's been one of the most persistent thorns in the side of this administration. Wolff had been conducting interviews with Jeffrey Epstein, yes, that Jeffrey Epstein, before Epstein died in his jail cell in 2019. And in those recorded interviews, Epstein allegedly told Wolff some very specific things about Melania Trump, things about how she first met Donald Trump, things that, according to Wolff, go directly through Epstein himself. Wolff made statements publicly about what he says Epstein told him, specifically that Melania first met her future husband on Epstein's private jet and that Epstein had introduced them. He also claimed that Epstein had sex with Melania a full year before she and Trump became a couple. These are explosive, unverified allegations. Melania's team has denied them aggressively and called them false. But here's where the story takes a turn that Melania's lawyers did not see coming. When Melania's legal team sent a letter to Michael Wolff threatening to sue him for over $1 billion, yes, $1 billion, unless he retracted those statements, issued a public apology, and paid her money, they thought they were scaring him into silence. That is exactly what a SLAPP lawsuit is designed to do. SLAPP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It's a tool used by powerful people to intimidate journalists and critics into shutting up by drowning them in expensive legal threats. The idea is simple. Even if you can't win the lawsuit, you make the cost of fighting it so high that the other person just caves. But Wolff didn't cave. Instead, he did something that completely flipped the script on Melania's legal strategy. On October 22, 2025, Wolff filed his own lawsuit against Melania Trump in the Manhattan Supreme Court in New York. He used New York's Anti-SLAPP statute, a law specifically designed to protect journalists and free speech from exactly this kind of legal intimidation. By suing her first in New York, Wolff gained something enormously powerful: subpoena power. That means if this case moves forward, Wolff's lawyers can compel Melania Trump, Donald Trump, and their entire circle, friends, associates, people who were part of that world of Eastern European models in New York during the 1990s, to testify under oath about Epstein, about everything. And that is precisely why Melania is scared.
Because this isn't just about one journalist in one lawsuit anymore. This is about what comes out the moment anyone in that circle has to sit in front of a court reporter and answer questions. And the Epstein files, which have been trickling out in the most damaging possible way, are making this worse with every passing week. The Department of Justice itself was caught trying to redact Trump's image from photographs in the Epstein files. When that was noticed and backlash erupted online, they were forced to release the unredacted originals. That tells you everything you need to know about how nervous this administration is about what those files contain. Now let's talk about what Melania has actually done since Wolff filed that lawsuit, because this is where her legal strategy becomes a masterclass in delay, deflection, and desperation. The very first problem Wolff encountered was serving Melania with the lawsuit. You might think that sounds simple. You hire someone to hand the papers to the defendant and you're done. But Melania Trump is the First Lady of the United States. She is surrounded at all times by a security detail that is among the most highly trained in the world. You cannot approach her on the street. You cannot walk up to the White House. Wolff's team tried to serve her lawyer, Alejandro Brito, a Florida-based attorney who had instructed everyone to direct communications for Melania through him. But when it actually came time to accept legal service on her behalf, Brito refused. He literally turned the papers away. One process-serving firm reportedly declined to even take the job. A second firm tried and failed. Eventually, Wolff's team managed to have papers handed to a doorman at Trump Tower in New York. Melania's legal team immediately pounced on this, arguing in court filings that Trump Tower is not Melania's legal residence, that she was never properly served, and that therefore the entire case should be thrown out. This became the first of what would be a series of procedural maneuvers, all aimed at one thing: buying time and keeping this case out of New York. In the final week of December 2025, while most of the country was focused on the holidays, Melania's legal team made their next move. They asked the federal court to take jurisdiction of the case away from the New York State Court where Wolff had filed it. Moving the case to federal court automatically stayed, meaning froze, any decisions the state court had been working toward, including the question of service. In one legal maneuver, they managed to reset the clock entirely. This is what Michael Wolff himself publicly described as a deliberate delay tactic. Then, in early January 2026, Melania's lawyers formally filed papers arguing the case should be dismissed altogether, citing what they called insufficient service of process, lack of personal jurisdiction, and a failure to state a valid legal claim. They also argued that if the court chose not to dismiss the case, it should be transferred not to any federal court in New York, but specifically to the Southern District of Florida.
Why Florida? This is where the story gets very interesting. Melania's team is arguing that her legal residence is in Florida, not New York. Donald and Melania Trump made a very public announcement back in 2019 that they were leaving New York and moving to Florida. They changed their voter registrations to Florida. They vote in Florida. And so her lawyers are now leaning heavily on this claimed Florida residency to argue that New York has no jurisdiction over her, and that if this case proceeds, it should happen in Florida. But Wolff's team is not buying it. They have publicly challenged the premise that Melania actually lives in Florida, pointing out that in practice, she spends an enormous amount of her time in New York, where her heart, her lifestyle, and her son Barron's school years were primarily based. Wolff has stated he knows where Melania actually lives and has made clear he intends to contest the Florida residency claim aggressively. In fact, his team has asked the court for a discovery process specifically to examine the Florida residency question, meaning if granted, Melania would have to submit to questions about her everyday life, her travel records, her mail, where she files her taxes, where she actually sleeps most nights. And if you think this is just a technical legal dispute, think again, because there is a very specific reason why Melania's team wants this case in Florida rather than New York. In the Southern District of Florida, there is a federal judge named Aileen Cannon. Judge Cannon became nationally known, or notorious depending on your perspective, for a series of rulings in Donald Trump's classified documents case that were widely seen as extraordinarily favorable to the former and now current president. Those rulings were eventually reversed or criticized by higher courts, but Cannon is still there. And inside the White House, according to reporting, she is apparently spoken of in certain circles as a future Supreme Court justice. Michael Wolff himself has written about this, noting that what the Trump camp really wants is for this case to land in what they are essentially treating as a friendly courthouse. Meanwhile, to handle this increasingly complicated legal situation, Melania brought in a new heavyweight legal team. She retained DLA Piper, the third largest law firm in the entire world. Specifically, she brought on a partner from that firm who was a former Supreme Court clerk to Justice Neil Gorsuch. This is not the kind of legal firepower you bring in for a case you think you're going to win easily or make disappear quietly. This is the kind of legal team you bring in when you are genuinely frightened about what might happen if this case reaches the discovery phase. Wolff has been direct about what he thinks Melania's endgame is. He said publicly that her team will try to run out the clock, using every procedural delay available to keep this case tied up in jurisdictional battles for as long as possible, months, potentially years. The hope, apparently, is that public attention will move on, that the Epstein files will fade from the news cycle, that some other crisis will come along and swallow this story whole. Which brings us to the Iran situation, because right now the Trump administration is rattling sabers and generating headlines about confrontations with Iran, ceasefire negotiations, and geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. And there are people, serious analysts, political commentators, journalists, who look at the timing of these escalations and ask a question that is uncomfortable but legitimate. Is foreign policy drama being used as a distraction tool? This administration has a documented history of generating noise to drown out bad news, and the Epstein files are about as bad as it gets for the people in that White House.
The public has not forgotten. Every week something new comes out, documents trickle into public view, images surface, details emerge, and with each new detail, the pressure on Melania's lawsuit intensifies, because her entire legal strategy is premised on the idea that people will stop caring, that the story will die. But it isn't dying. The public comment sections, the social media conversation, the persistent search traffic around Epstein and Melania's name, none of it is going away. If anything, the combination of the lawsuit, the Epstein files, and the documentary has kept her name in a news cycle that she desperately wants to exit. Speaking of the documentary, let's not forget that in the middle of all of this, Melania launched a $75 million film about herself. Amazon paid $40 million just for the licensing rights and spent another $35 million marketing it. It opened in theaters at the end of January and proceeded to collapse at the box office, eventually disappearing entirely from the top 38 films by its fourth week. When it moved to Amazon Prime streaming on March 9th, it briefly hit #1, but by Thursday of that same week, it had already dropped to third place, falling behind a Nicole Kidman series and a murder mystery. By some measures, it was sitting below Sinners. The critical reception was devastating, an 8% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. Reviewers described it as a hagiographic vanity project, a vapid infomercial dressed up as a documentary. The audience score told a different story, 99% approval. But that number triggered immediate and widespread speculation about bot activity, given that a gap that massive between critics and audiences is essentially unprecedented in Rotten Tomatoes history. So, here is where we stand. Melania Trump threatened to sue Michael Wolff for $1 billion to silence him. Wolff sued her first. The lawsuit gives him subpoena power over her, her husband, and their Epstein-connected world. Her legal team has responded with a strategy built almost entirely on delay, refusing service, challenging jurisdiction, moving to federal court, arguing for a venue transfer to Florida, where a friendly judge waits. She's hired one of the biggest law firms on earth. She's spending millions trying to make this go away. And it isn't going away. The Iran headlines will pass, they always do, but subpoena power doesn't expire because the news cycle moved on. Court filings don't disappear because a foreign policy crisis grabbed the front page. And the Epstein files, dripping out one revelation at a time, are not going to stop just because someone in the White House wishes they would. Melania Trump made a calculated bet that threatening Michael Wolff would silence him. Instead, it handed him a weapon, and the longer her legal team delays, the longer this story stays alive, and the more time the Epstein files have to keep doing exactly what they've been doing, filling in the picture, piece by piece, of a world that certain very powerful people would give almost anything to keep buried. The subject has not been changed, not by the Iran war drums, not by the documentary, not by the billion-dollar threat that started all of this. And if Michael Wolff has anything to say about it, and his public statements make very clear that he does, it never will be.